So welcome everyone. I am just delighted that you're able to join us for today's webinar. My name is Dr. Hillary Nixon, and I serve as the Deputy Executive Director of the Mineta Transportation Institute at San Jose State University. MTI leads the California State University Transportation Consortium, funded by the Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017, and the Mineta Consortium for Transportation Mobility, funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. Our mission is to increase mobility for all by improving the safety, efficiency, accessibility, and convenience of our nation's transportation system. I am pleased to introduce today's moderator, Shiloh Ballard, a longtime supporter of the Safe Routes to School program and president and executive director of the Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition. Shiloh.
Thank you so much, Hillary. I am happy to be moderating today. For those of you who don't know the Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition, our mission is to improve the community, economy, and environment through the everyday use of the bicycle. We focus on advocacy, which is the better word for lobbying, for safe streets through better design. And we also focus on behavioral change through programs like Bike to School Days and some of the stuff we're going to be talking about today. So during today's webinar, if you have any questions for our presenters, you can submit them through the conference chat feature. We're recording this webinar, and the link to view it will be available shortly after the webinar on our website and social media pages on MTI's website. So today's webinar explores the relationship between the presence of Safe Routes to Schools programs, SRTS, and the likelihood that children will travel to school by active modes. It also explores the potential to bolster existing Safe Routes programs by leveraging university, student, and city partnerships. Both projects featured in this webinar dive into the racial and geographical demographics of the student population in areas with Safe Routes programs at different stages of implementation. I also wanted to note, because it's really exciting to pull in some data that we did in partnership with MTI last year. So MTI and SVBC, Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition, teamed up to do the first ever public opinion poll in Santa Clara County to benchmark attitudes towards transportation with a focus on bicycling. And one of the important findings was that kids who ride as children are more likely to ride as adults. These are things that we know. But even more important is that kids who continue to ride through their teenage years are even more likely to ride as adults. So knowing this data point makes this conversation even more important, as it shows how significant Safe Routes programs are to creating the transportation habits that last through adulthood. On that note, it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Michelle Lieberman, Consulting and Program Support Director for the Safe Routes Partnership. Professor Anurag Pandey, Professor of Civil Engineering at California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo. Professor Carol Vulgaris, Assistant Professor of Urban Planning at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, and Rick Koss, Certified Urban Planner and a faculty member in the Master of Urban Planning program at San Jose State University. And I probably slaughtered some people's names, and I always ask people forgiveness. My name being Shiloh, I'm always used to it, so I am sympathetic. Also joining Rick today are 3 students from the Urban and Regional Planning Department at San Jose State University: Branka Todorevik, Sue Ellen Katz-Atkinson, and Justin Flynn. These master's students worked directly with the city of San Jose on their Safe Routes to Schools plan. And with that, I am going to hand it off to Michelle.
Thanks everyone for having me today. If you're not familiar with our organization, we are the Safe Routes Partnership. We're a national nonprofit organization, and our mission is to advance safe walking and rolling to and from schools and in everyday life. Our organization was founded to support Safe Routes in school, and we still work on that. but we also work on supporting broader active transportation and healthy communities nationwide. Next slide. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about where we see Safe Routes to School in 2021 and beyond, starting by looking back at 2019, pre-pandemic. In 2019, we surveyed Safe Routes to School programs around the country, and this map shows the responses that we received. At that time, Safe Routes to School programs existed in every state, in rural, suburban, and urban communities. And as you may know, Safe Routes to School programs come from a lot of different forms. Some are really well funded by grant programs and organized and run by cities or health departments or school districts. Others are run by parents and volunteers and school staff. So there's really no standard definition of a Safe Routes to School program, but all of them incorporate one or more aspect of what we call the 6 E's that I show here on the right. And they're working to make it safer for kids walking and rolling to school and encourage more walking and rolling. Next slide. So come 2020 and about March, schools really changed. And so Safe Routes to School programs had to change with them. So really the last year, our theme has been pivot, 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 as schools went to distance learning and some came back or in hybrid or continued distance learning. So Safe Routes to School programs around the country have been really incredibly resilient. And I think you'll find that Safe Routes to School programs, the staff, their volunteers truly care about their communities. So when students stopped going to school on campus, many programs responded by tending to other immediate needs in their local communities, whether that be helping get meals and supplies to families, or working with their local city and county to get slow streets designed to provide places for families to get physical activity. So a lot of programs pivoted to virtual bike and safety education, doing family-centered encouragement activities, walk audits, and more planning for better streets as we come back, and looking at safe routes to parks and other places. And all along the way, I think Safe Routes to School programs have really kept raising traffic safety needs, as well as the benefits of walking and biking to school that they had on physical activity and mental health and physical health of students, really top of mind. Next slide. So as part of that work in 2020, we worked with a group of Safe Routes to School practitioners around the country to create a guide for what we're looking at back to school 2020. And this included guiding recommendations, strategies, tools, considerations, and advice for long-term planning. We really wanted this to be a guide for short-term actionable activities designed to adapt and fit the unique needs of individual schools and communities, that looked at options for remote Safe Routes to School planning, in person, fully in person, and hybrid. Next slide. So what do we see for 2021 and beyond? I think as school campuses continue to reopen, continuing to address transportation and physical activity as students and for these families. Walking and rolling are really important options as families may have more concerns about riding the bus. And honestly, there's a lot of complicated logistics around renting school buses with physical distancing requirements. So really having the options for kids to get to and from school without a car, without riding the bus. Making sure those options are safe, convenient, and provide those opportunities for physical distancing is also important. And I think we have a really huge treasure trove of strategies, tools, and ideas and lessons learned from 2020 as those programs pivoted and created new materials online and designed new activities. And finally, Safe Routes to School plays an important role in helping communities adapt to change and anticipating, what school is going to look like, and identifying ways to support kids and their families is really important. Next slide. And last, I'll be around for Q&A, but we have a number of resources on our website. That back to school guide I talked about, as well as resources for starting a Safe Routes to School program, engaging youth, doing different activities, and setting up different strategies that really build that support and the safety for students and their families. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And now I'm going to hand it over to Professors Pandy and Vulgaris.
Thank you, Shallow. Appreciate it. It's just great to be here. So I will be starting to talk about a recent research study that we did, sponsored by Minnesota Transportation Institute. Got some great help from Shiloh and her group at the Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition to formulate our ideas as we develop the proposal and the research design. So thank you for that. I want to make sure that I acknowledge, obviously, the co-authors of this study that we presented also at TRB. Dr. Vulgaris, who you will be hearing from pretty soon. Rehani, she's a student at San Jose State. And then Serena Alexander, Dr. Alexander is a professor, assistant professor, also at San Jose State. And then want to acknowledge a couple of other students, Jane Jimenez and Catherine Lee, who helped us out with different stages of the data collection, even though they were not co-authors of this paper. They did help out with the project and help out. So next slide, please. So as Michelle talked about, the elements of the Safe Routes to School program, the 6 E's, the education, encouragement, just want to make sure that we point out, we used to call engagement enforcement, and not really the right term. We don't necessarily are looking for enforcement. What we want is the engagement from the community, where where there is a safe environment that's being created by volunteers, by community volunteers in collaboration with the police officers, rather than a brute enforcement of rules. And then engineering, equity, and evaluation. Next slide, please. So Safe Routes to School program, they were introduced as from a federal perspective under the Safety LU program legislation in 2005. In 2012, the MAP 21, Moving Ahead for Progress, the transportation legislation in 2012 discontinued the federal funding for that program directly, but the states could still use the active transportation funds, active transportation program funds, for implementing these SRTS programs, the Safe Routes to School programs. And they have really become a fixture of many school communities, many communities throughout the US. They run their school Safe Routes to School program, but the way the programs are run are quite different. And there's big differences, as Michelle also mentioned, in how these programs are implemented. Most of the programs have some sort of educational event that sort of is the core of the program, but then there are a lot of programs that also implement engineering improvements to go along with that. Next slide, please. So what we wanted to see in this research was that, are there factors that influence the success of the Safe Routes to School program? And also, to what extent these programs are successful in encouraging the walking and biking mode, or if they are actually helping out the folks who use the walk and bike or active modes of transportation to school. And we applied 2 different methods, a quantitative method that basically involved analysis of land use and demographic factors affecting the success of the Safe Routes to School program. And we used California Household Travel Survey data for that from the Bay Area. And then the qualitative approach, where we conducted in-depth interviews with individuals who are involved in planning and implementing the Safe Routes to School program at the school level. So I will now hand it over to Dr. Vulgaris for her discussion on the quantitative methods of the research. Take it away, Carol.
Right, we can move to the next slide as well. So the basis for the quantitative part of this research was to compare rates of walking and biking to school among students who attend school in a community where there was an identified Safe Routes to School program to those who attended school in a neighborhood where there was not a Safe Routes to School program that we identified. The way we identify Safe Routes to School program, again, during the period when many Safe Routes to School programs received funding from federal programs, they reported the existence of those programs to a database with some performance metrics. So we use that database as the basis to determine whether a neighborhood had some form of Safe Routes to School programming. One difference between this research and some other studies that had been done previously is that we started from the assumption that a student who is at a school where there is some kind of safe routes to school programming is potentially affected by that program. So previous studies that looked at the effectiveness of safe routes to school programs had a very strong emphasis on, out of the 6 E's, the engineering piece, so infrastructure improvement. So they might compare before and after, if a new crosswalk was put in as part of a safe routes to school program, how did that affect students' likelihood to walk and bike to school? Particularly in this area where there's such a broad range of safe routes to school program, including some that aren't infrastructure improvements. So programs like walk and bike to school days, assemblies, and this, a strong educational element. We wanted to be able to capture sort of the full effect of those programs that would have affected potentially all students within a school. If we can go to the next slide. So in our analysis, we wanted to look at the effects of safe routes to school program relative to a bunch of other things that we know or guessed might influence the likelihood of students walking to school. The biggest one on here is honestly probably distance, where if you live within walking distance of a school, you're much more likely to walk to school. Likewise with biking, so how far does a student need to commute to get to school? And then some other characteristics of the neighborhood, the individual, the household. Prior research that suggests that there are differences by race and ethnicity in how likely students are to walk to school. So these are some of the things we wanted to account for in our study as well. And then we can go to the next slide. The biggest thing we were looking for here, this is kind of a description of sort of how our regression model was set up, which I don't feel like I need to go into a lot of detail on, other than to comment on. The biggest thing we were looking at were two things. One is I'll use the word effect. What's the actual, what difference does it make having a safe routes to school program or not in the overall likelihood of someone walking or cycling to school, but also what's the effect of a safe routes to school program on these other things that we know have an influence. So for example, does distance make less of a difference in the decision to walk to school if there's a safe routes to school program or not? Do safe routes to school programs maybe diminish some of the effects of race and ethnicity on the likelihood that someone will walk or bike to school? And if we go to the next slide, you can see, I think, some of the initial results we saw. So the first of these is just the overall difference. Students who are attending schools in a place with safe routes to school programming were more likely than their peers at schools without that programming to walk or bike to school. So that's encouraging. And the next slide, we see some of these more kind of individualized effects, particularly looking at the effect of race and distance. So one of the biggest differences we saw along kind of race ethnicity lines was that, at least within our study area, we were looking at the Asian and Pacific Islander students were less likely, for example, than white students to walk or bike to school, but that the presence of a safe routes to school program more or less eliminated that difference, which was really encouraging. And also that at least within sort of a threshold distance of about 3/4 of a mile, as students, for example, moved from maybe about a 1/4 mile to 3/4 of a mile, the likelihood of walking in tracks without a safe routes to school program, the likelihood of walking to school decreased, but that drop off, based on kind of our model and what we observed in the data, the difference was less influential. Students were willing to walk further distances to get to school when they were attending school in a place that had safe routes to school programming. And so that's a quick overview of our quantitative result. Anurag is going to go into the qualitative results. I also do want to mention that the results of this study, and I can put a link in chat, have been published in an MTI report. See if this works for those that want to kind of read further about it. And in answer to a question that's come in through chat, this study was about the likelihood of walking and biking to school. So we didn't get into collision rates or injury rates or any of the safety impacts. Although based on other literature, we do know that as more people participate in active transportation tends to become safer. So sort of a safety in numbers effect as drivers become more aware and more accustomed to seeing children traveling as pedestrians and cyclists. So I'll pass the time back to Anurag now.
Thank you, Carol. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about the qualitative analysis, and I want to pick up on what Carol just said. You know, when you have these types of programs, safety in numbers can affect, and I see that in my personal life as well. Right? Since I started biking to work, and I've just, as a motorist, I've become more aware of bicyclists around me. So I wonder if there is an impact of having these walk to school events or bike to school events have some impact on the driving behavior as well. Somewhat of future research questions, I guess. So what we did was we conducted in-depth interview for our qualitative analysis with administrator, with parents who were involved with the SRTS program. What we noticed was that when we asked them questions about engineering-related improvements and all of the other improvements that may potentially be part of the Safe Routes to School program, what we learned was that in the Bay Area, what our study area was, the programs generally emphasize education and encouragement piece quite a bit. And there were some unique recent initiatives that came out of the SRTS programs. They included free bike repair service that I thought was interesting. And then our interviews emphasized the need to increase visible safety measures. And they were like having more parent volunteers, increasing the number of teachers on out duty. And one of the odd ones that stuck out was the adding speed bumps. And I highlight that only because that was the only sort of engineering type measure that came up in our discussions, sort of like, you know, as we were asking questions, this was the only improvement that came up that the interviewee said would be useful to have, you know, as part of the Safe Routes to School program. So that I thought was interesting. Next slide, please. And through the qualitative analysis, what we learned from our interviewees could be sort of summarized. It fit very nicely into the Snyder's operational theory of routine mode choice. Snyder's was a 2013 paper that talked about based on interviews conducted in the Bay Area. And that was overall about the mode choice, like how people make their choice of mode overall, not just to go to school or anything, but overall folks are making their decisions based on awareness and availability, basic safety and security, enjoyment, habit, and convenience and costs. And what we learned was that the factors that we learned from folks in our interviews, they fit nicely within those 6 categories. So for example, parents talked about proper communication between schools and parents. So that fits in within that awareness and availability category that Schneider talked about. And then the basic safety and security, same thing, that improvements of route to school. And then the last one that came up, and then enjoyment, like, you know, the very interesting thing that came out was that how kids and their parents made social connections during these walk to school events. And that could add to enjoyment, and that could actually lead to folks choosing more active modes. And then the last one I want to talk about is convenience and cost. This through long-term changes in land use. And that's something that, you know, we have to look at, you know, that distance parameter that Carol talked about, Dr. Volgaris talked about, was that how if you live very far from school, more than, you know, let's say 1.2 miles, then your options then to use active transportation mode are quite limited. And those things, like, you know, how do we place people where they want to go? That's a long-term sort of land use and housing challenge that we need to keep in mind. May be difficult to implement in the Safe Routes to School context right away. Next slide, please. So I would, in conclusion, just want to make sure that I emphasize the highlights here. The SRTS programs look at health and safety of students in 2 different ways. Safety of students who would bike anyway, and then hopefully increasing the share of students who walk or bike to school. So those are the 2 shared aims of that. We focus more on, like, you know, how does the increasing the share happen in this study, but they definitely improve safety, as Carol talked about from the previous literature. With short distance of walking, the impact of race and ethnicity sort of eliminated using the Safe Routes or through the Safe Routes to School program. So that we thought was very interesting. It was able to alleviate the racial and geographic barriers. So again, it reduced or it increased the number of students who walked or biked to school within that 3/4 of a mile threshold distance. So that was very interesting result. And our qualitative data suggests that there is an appreciation for the engagement piece and the education piece of the SRTS program. So SRTS programs don't all have to be about the expensive or relatively more expensive engineering improvement. They could potentially be about the education and still make a difference in the scheme of things. So with that, I would like to pass the baton back to our moderator, Shiloh. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us by email. And I'm also reachable by email and on Twitter. So feel free to reach out if there are more questions beyond the webinar. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, professors. So now, Rick, hoping you can tell us about this university to city partnership that you and your students have worked on. So go ahead, Rick.
Thank you, Shiloh. I'd be happy to. And thank you, MTI, for hosting this webinar. I'd like to give a special welcome to any students that are with us today. I understand there's a few from Cal Poly, and a special welcome to all of you, because this part of our webinar is all about students and the fantastic work of some of my recent students. So year after year, I have the great pleasure of working with urban planning graduate students here at San Jose State University. And two of my current students and one graduated student are with us today, and you'll hear from them in just a moment. So my job today is to describe how students, especially urban planning students, can be an integral part of Safe Routes to School programs. So you'll hear how two service learning projects connected our students to Safe Routes projects in San Jose, and in turn, how this experience played a role in shaping the professional path of three students. Next slide, please. So in our Masters of Urban Planning program, all students are required to complete what we call a capstone studio course. As we like to say, this course gets students out of the classroom and into the neighborhoods through service learning projects. I also integrate project-based work into my advanced GIS for urban planning course. So many of our projects take place through a unique multi-sector partnership called Communiversity. And as you can see there, it's really all in the name. It's a three-sector partnership between a local community, the faculty and students at our university, and the staff and elected officials of the city of San Jose. So there we get Communiversity. So from day one in my classes, students are asked to adopt an asset-based community development mindset. Now, many traditional urban planning approaches position the urban planners as the sole experts whose job it is to, quote unquote, fix neighborhood problems. However, the asset-based mindset, in contrast, positions local residents as the experts who can articulate their planning priorities. So the faculty and students in turn provide expertise in terms of data collection methods, GIS mapping, data analysis, and community engagement techniques. So all of this expertise plays a very important role in Safe Routes to Schools projects. So the first Safe Routes project you'll hear about today adopted what we call the collaborative neighborhood planning model. And this model has three phases. The first is community assessment, where we document existing conditions and demographics in the study area. The second phase is community building, where we establish warm working relationships between our students and community leaders. And the third phase is what we call implementation bridges. This step involves identifying programs and funding sources to bring the residents' neighborhood planning priorities to fruition. Next slide, please. There we go. So in a moment, you'll hear from Sue Ellen Atkinson, who was part of a wonderful team of students engaged in a Safe Routes project at Ann Darling Elementary School back in 2011. So these images show the conditions that students must navigate on their way to this school. Many of these students come from immigrant families whose parents often do not have the means or time to drive their children to school. So as you can see from these images, the conditions are clearly built to accommodate the car, and the walking and biking experience is very unpleasant and potentially hazardous for the students. Next slide, please. So in my not so humble view, in order for any Safe Routes to Schools project to be successful, a rigorous street-by-street analysis of physical conditions is an essential starting point. So here's where our graduate students really shine. The map that you're seeing here shows evidence of adopting that asset-based community mindset that I mentioned earlier. And within 4 weeks of starting the course, the students produced this map to begin cataloging the established and trusted organizations in the study area. And this in turn leads to forming partnerships. Next slide, please. And this map reflects the conditions of sidewalks within the school attendance area. The students used a standardized audit tool to document everything from sidewalk width to street trees to driveway curb cuts, speed limits, and street crossing infrastructure. So they found that the streets in red were in poor condition from a pedestrian perspective, orange in fair condition, and green in good condition. Just wonderful, detailed, rigorous work. Students really shined here. Next slide, please. And quickly, before I hand it over to Sue Ellen, here are some scenes that represent one aspect of the culmination of our work in the Anne Darling community. We worked with the Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition to host a bike rodeo, and the bike rodeo featured many games, many activities that emphasized safe riding and helmet use. It was a huge success. And we conducted a survey of the students before and after the event, and they showed dramatically increased awareness of safety concerns and a dedicated commitment to wearing their helmets regularly. So with that, let me pass it over to my colleague and past student, Sue Ellen Atkinson.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Rick. So as Rick mentioned, I was a part of the Anne Darling Safe Routes to School graduate school project in 2010-2011. After I graduated in 2011, I continued my transportation planning work into my career, and I'm currently the principal transportation planner for the city of San Mateo. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as part of the Anne Darling Safe Routes to School project, and as one of the key aspects that I really took away from this experience, we worked with the students, the parents, and the school administration to really build this program from the ground up. And that's something that I've brought forward into my career in the way that the families can take ownership of the Safe Routes to School program and really ensure that Safe Routes to School becomes part of the culture of the school. In that way, it can be longer lasting and really take on a life of its own in a way that programs that are brought into the schools by a city or by a county can't do. Local jurisdictions can provide materials and support for programs, but as you can see in these photos, the families are really the heart of the Safe Routes to School effort. And the kids and the enthusiasm that they brought into making the program something of their own is really something that is very unique in Safe Routes to School. And again, one of the key takeaways that I've brought into my career. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Another really fun event that we did with the Anne Darling School community coming out of that parent task force effort was a walking school bus day. And we put together walking school buses with these really incredible school buses that the kids and their parents built together to generate enthusiasm and to generate pride in using active transportation to get to school. We also can have a bike tour on the way to school, but we chose to do a walking school bus because it was more accessible to the students and their parents. As part of the bike rodeo and the walking school bus, the kids really learned and grew a sense of pride in their way in methods to walk and bike to school safely. And in that way, we're also able to educate the families as well. By doing so, we can really encourage a new generation that's using multimodal transportation options, because if kids are excited about walking and biking to school, they'll tend to nudge their parents in that direction as well. By doing that, we can increase the mode share for active transportation, which helps our kids be more alert at school and ready to go once they get to school. And something that we found through the parent task force and through the walking school bus activity is that active transportation really builds pride in the community, and the students and the families take ownership in their built environment and really want to see it succeed. So with that, I'll pass it over to Justin Flynn to discuss his project.
Thank you, Sue Ellen. Next slide, please. Bronca and my work for the Walk and Roll project focused on 4 elementary and middle schools located in disadvantaged areas of San Jose in the fall of 2020. My subject school was Sierra Mont Middle School, located at the upper portion of this map, and Bronca's school was Backrod Elementary School, located on the western side. Next slide, please. Virtual site visits were an important part of our project, such as the Sierra Mont site visit that occurred on November 13th, 2020. Participants included our group, Rick Koss, the Walk and Roll Program Manager, Ann Jasper, and several members of the school staff, student body, or parents. These visits provided us the opportunity to hear from those who would be directly affected by our work and provided valuable on-the-ground insights into the transportation conditions around our schools. The map in this slide, which I have cropped to protect private information, was put together by a Sierra Mont Middle School student that plotted his walking route to school. This and similar insights helped to inform our efforts at delivering relevant GIS maps. Next slide, please. We took these insights and transformed them into the GIS maps containing the precise intersections and other locations of comments that we received during the site visits. The map in this slide was combined with heat maps of collision data involving pedestrians or cyclists during the 10 most recent years prior to our study. 2 of the intersections over which site visit participants expressed concern were also hotspots that showed up in the collision data, which can be seen with the red highlighted circles. Next slide, please. In addition to maps to aid grant applications, we also produce promotional maps, such as this one, designed to help parents, students, and school staff to visualize school neighborhoods and possibly entice them into participating in the program. This map was designed to show the area near Backrod Elementary School that is within a 5, 10, or 15-minute walk of one of the school's 3 entrances using ArcGIS Pro's Network Analyst tool. Next slide, please. One of the resources that we used extensively in our project was Esri's Community Analyst, which is a web-based tool that shows simple maps alongside presentation-ready layouts of demographic information and other data. In this slide, we can see education, employment, and income data, along with key demographic facts about the area within Parkview Elementary School's attendance zone boundary. The Walk and Roll project provided a real-world focus to complement and sharpen the GIS skills that I learned in class. It was through this project that I truly became comfortable working with the many functions of ArcGIS Pro and built a strong portfolio that I can use to demonstrate mastery of GIS to potential employers after graduation. Now I will hand it over to Bronca to talk about her work for the program.
Thank you, Justin. Next slide, please. My name is Branka, and I was on the same team with Justin in the advanced GIS class. My focus was Backrod Elementary. The map you see shows the attendance area, collisions as hotspots, traffic light locations, and bikeways. We performed a network analysis to assess walkability and showed walkable streets in shades of blue. The school's location here limits the possible walkable area because it is close to the attendance boundary. The highway divides the attendance area into 2 parts, shown in yellow. Photos of the 2 underpasses that could connect the area south of the highway are on the left. Our preliminary conclusion was the underpasses are not adequate for school children and that only the immediate neighborhood is walkable. Next slide, please. Our next step was community engagement. In COVID times, this meeting had to be virtual. The team arranged a Zoom meeting with the Backrod principal, Rigo Palacios, and the parent representative, Monica Perez. We learned that many parents drive their children to school mainly because the families living south of the highway indeed choose to drive. The other reason is the bilingual program, the only of a kind in San Jose. The neighborhood is busy with automobile traffic during drop-off and pickup, and the narrow streets cannot accommodate the load. Ms. Monica shared a map her husband and she made showing where congestion and unsafe conditions happen. Mr. Palacios and Ms. Monica suggested that the drive-through would help mitigate the situation, and we discussed several locations for it. Next slide, please. The map in the middle section of this slide is a result of the virtual meeting. We mapped the community input, updated the network analysis with confirmed school entrances, and marked the possible drive-through locations. We can see that despite some traffic calming upgrades, Geese Road is still an impediment to safe walking, and that the narrow streets, especially sections marked with orange color, cannot handle the traffic. We hope this analysis will help Backyard community get the drive-through they wish for. Next slide, please. And finally, per client's request and for internal use only, we mapped public safety data. We used crimemapping.com and the registered sex offender database. Overall, the client-based project in the advanced GIS class was a great experience. We were exposed not only to learning how to apply our GIS skills, but also about safe routes to school. And we were lucky to hear from the community despite COVID-related constraints. With this, I conclude my presentation, and Professor Koss is now going to take over. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Branka. And also thank you, Sue Ellen and Justin, great job. Let's go to the next slide, please. So to wrap up our part, I hope that our short presentation provided you with a sense of how our urban planning graduate students at San Jose State have played an instrumental role in safe routes to school planning. So service learning projects, such as the ones you've heard about here, have been really instrumental in launching the careers of many of our graduates, a few of whom you met today. And some others are highlighted in this slide, showing pictures of our past students and their current employers. The benefits for students in engaging with these projects are many, including turning theory into practice, and what I like to call empathy-based planning, the ability to get into the shoes of the communities we serve. And the benefits to the local communities are also numerous, including working with students under faculty guidance who can turn their aspirations into action. And I'm pleased to say that the students' work at Ann Darling Elementary that you heard about earlier led directly to the City of San Jose securing over $100,000 in community development block grant funds to install safety improvements around the school. So I very much hope that the work of Branka, Justin, and their peers will produce similar benefits for the schools they partnered with. So thank you all. I hope you enjoyed our presentation. And I hope you'll also read the report we produced for MTI that goes into these projects in more detail.
Thank you all so much for these compelling findings. I wanted to once again invite folks to submit some questions in the chat. And before we do that, we do have a couple of questions that were submitted earlier that I'm going to go through. And the first one actually relates a little bit to a question that was posed in the chat. And that is, and these questions are going to be open to any of our panelists. So feel free to put your video on and your mute buttons off. So first question, what can we do to start a conversation with city leaders about safe routes? And so that's about city leaders. And the question in the chat, which is related, is how do you establish a warm relationship between your students and the community? So who'd like to tackle that question?
I'd be happy to address the second part of the question, at least in terms of connecting students with community members. Could we start there?
Go for it.
Well, I often like to say that community members, especially community members in what are typically called underrepresented or marginalized communities, really feel comfortable, for the most part, opening up to students, as opposed to city officials or city staff. Because students, by and large, I think are perceived as open-minded, non-threatening. They're there to help, they're there to listen. And we really capitalize on that existing perception of students. And I think the conversations tend to flow very naturally from that. But in preparation for our meetings with community members, we spend some time in class talking about active listening techniques, careful documentation of what the residents are sharing with us. And as much as possible, we try to instill this sense that the residents are really the experts in the local community. And the students convey that in their initial conversations. But it's our job to do the proper research and the proper data documentation.
Great. Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
Sure, Shiloh, I can chime in a little bit on working with city staff and city leaders on safe routes to school programs. I think that the most important thing is really getting your voice heard, participating in city council meetings, participating in, if your city has a planning commission, a transportation commission, something of that nature. Speaking during public comment makes make sure that the elected and appointed officials in each jurisdiction hear what the community is looking for. If there's any opportunity to be part of the goal setting or priority setting for your city's city council or commissions, that's also a great opportunity to have resonant voices heard, but also reaching out directly to city staff is very effective. City staff, speaking for myself, we're here to serve the community and we want to hear what the community wants. And also I know, as you're aware, the Silicon Valley Bike Coalition has set up local teams throughout the Bay Area, and being involved in that effort can help link with jurisdictions and move efforts forward in terms of bike and pedestrian safety.
Thank you. I very much appreciate the plug for Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition local teams as a great way to start those conversations and to get involved at the local level. I'm going to move on to our next question, and I think this one is appropriate for Michelle. And the question is, how are states generally paying for and promoting safe routes programs?
Yeah. Safe routes to school programs, as you've heard today, vary in configuration, how they're funded. So there's a lot of different ways in which local programs are funded. But I'd say for the most part, still the majority of funding for safe routes to school comes from the Transportation Alternatives Program, or the Transportation Alternatives Set Aside, which is the federal funding that goes towards walking and biking alternative transportation modes. I would say most states and most programs are still relying on that as like the biggest funding source. And in California, for those of us who are in California, for us, it's the Active Transportation Program, which combines that federal funding along with some state funding to create that program.
Great. Anyone else want to chime in on this question? All right, seeing none, I'm going to move on. Here's one of our favorite topics, and that's speed. The question being, how can we reduce speeds on our city streets so that it becomes safer for school children to walk and bike to school? And I also wanted to add a little bit of commentary here, and that goes back to the public opinion research that we did with MTI. One of the questions we asked folks is we were trying to get a sense for what is palatable from the public's perspective in terms of policy changes to make our streets more safe. And we asked things like, are you okay with us removing parking? Are you okay with us removing a lane for driving? And the answer to those questions was, no, not really okay with that. But when we asked about speed, people generally said, yes, we need to slow people down. So that speaks to this question here. How can we reduce speeds on our city streets so that it becomes safer for school children to walk and bike to school? Who'd like to take a crack at that one?
I can try that. So yes, so definitely, speed reduction as a goal is something that, it's challenging, reducing. But I think there is some glimmer of hope, as you talked about, right? There is folks who are open to reducing speed. I think there is that argument is that as more people start to bike in, it's going to be sort of a snowball type of phenomenon. You hope that, there is, once you get that ball rolling, there would be more people that are open to sort of, engaging with these types of measures. even though at the beginning, people are very averse to, losing their parking spot and whatnot. One thing I think we have to look at is definitely how do we redesign the streets, right? So we have to, there is different pieces of it. You have to kind of make sure that, your fire truck can still travel and all of that. But I think we have to focus on the street redesign. I think once you reduce the lane width, you make sure you provide for bike access, that's when the speed reduction can happen. I don't think if we leave the 12-foot lane and 2 lanes in each direction, or leave these one-way streets open, and we just reduce the speed limit somehow, that I don't think is going to work. I think we need to focus on street redesign, and that will sort of get that snowball rolling, and then hopefully more and more folks will be open to the idea. That's just my 2 cents on that.
Thanks, Professor. I'm actually going to ask Sue Ellen if she might have some insight onto this question, since she's now working for a city and she's on the front lines and dealing with community members and others who may or may not want speed to be reduced, and how you go about doing that. So I'm wondering if you have some insight on this question. How does one go about reducing speeds on streets in order to increase safety?
I would echo the prior comments that reducing speeds directly in front of schools solely is not sufficient in increasing student safety on the way to school. You need to look at the full path of travel for bicyclists and pedestrians. So I would caveat with that point. But reducing speed limits near schools is something that can be done with city council support. There are certain findings that are required in order to reduce speed limits, certain characteristics of the roadways. And if there is that support at the city council level to approve such reductions in speed, then the city can establish the policy that when those certain conditions are met, the speed limits can be reduced. That does require signage. It requires partnership with the police department to ensure that once those speed postings are up, that they're actually being followed. And there has been some research shown that when speed limits are reduced, the speeds at schools initially go down because there is a lot of education out there, there is a lot of enforcement, but then over time, the not so great habits sort of creep back in. So it's an ongoing need to have the reminders of what the speed limits are, to have the education, to have the outreach, and to make sure that folks know what behaviors are expected and what the legal speed limits are. But yeah, also to say that you need to extend beyond just the school frontages in terms of looking at the path of travel.
Excellent, thank you. I want to pull in another question from the chat here that's asking about culture. Essentially, there are some schools or neighborhoods where a culture of walking and biking already exists, and some where it doesn't. And this also speaks to a little bit, Professor Pandey, of what you referred to early on about some racial disparities and you noticing a difference between Asian Pacific Islander community. Can you speak to just kind of, if you had any further conclusions about why that may or may not be, the relationship to culture, the relationship to disadvantaged communities? Can you tie that all together and draw some conclusions?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that the good news is that the Safe Routes to School program do help in eliminating some of that culture gap that we see, right? I mean, if there is a Safe Routes to School program, but it doesn't have the active culture, so I think starting that cultural ball rolling at the school level is probably a good idea. So just having those programs where, you basically you start with the bike to school day, and then you sort of start building that awareness into it. So I don't have any sort of silver bullet answers, of course, but I think our research does show that if you have an active Safe Routes to School program, even though it focuses mostly on just these one-time events or just gets that ball rolling, it does start to chip away at folks' reluctance to have active modes to school. So I think starting small and starting with some educational and engagement programs at the school level is probably is a good starting point for shifting the culture. The change might be slow, but it would in fact eliminate where you could have folks who live at that that mid threshold of 3/4 of a mile start to take more active modes to school, and that's where. And then again, once folks start taking that route, people start demanding more safer infrastructure for the students to use, and I think that would get you started. So that would be my opinion on that. Is that based on backed by research? Is that you start with even smaller engagement and educational events at the school level and start to chip away at that cultural barriers.
Great. I'm going to
jump in there. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
As building on that, I think this speaks to one of the issues we had in even setting up the experimental design is that when you're looking at the effects of a program, it's nice to have this sort of before and after. But something that quickly, became apparent as we were designing this project was that Safe Routes to School programs, if they're going to be effective in sort of establishing this long-term cultural change, the way people think about walking and cycling to school, they need to be kind of continuous and ongoing. And so, before and after what? So thinking about Safe Routes to School programs rather than Safe Routes to School projects and events, this idea that it's kind of this continuous part of the curriculum, what the school does, that it's not this this thing you do and then you've solved the problem. As the comment suggested, the population of the school turns over regularly, even in places that aren't terribly transient, as students kind of age in and out. And so this isn't something that you can kind of quickly fix. And now we're a place where there's an active culture, that there's this constant maintenance that needs to happen.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Thank you for flagging that, especially given the transient population that we're dealing with. How do you create a culture and make it stick? And that's the challenge of all of us advocates out there that are doing this work. And that kind of relates to another question we wanted to ask here. And I think this is probably goes to Rick. What are some of the main objectives and concerns of the parent task force that guided the Safe Routes planning at Ann Darling Elementary School? I think, it probably, when you're starting with the parents, there's probably more of a likelihood that you can create a culture that's going to stick, because you're really talking about what matters to them. So I think, Rick, this question is for you.
Sure, yeah, I can offer some thoughts, and my thoughts actually build nicely on the previous two thoughts. Recall in my presentation that we adopt what we call a collaborative neighborhood planning model. The first step in the model is community assessment, but the second step is what we call community building. And this is the step in which the students worked directly with local parents to form a parents task force. And the students found these parents by thinking about their asset-based model, where they went out, they found trusted institutions, they found trusted individuals in the community, and they were able to bring together about 8 or 9 moms, they're all moms, that were committed to this effort. So this parents task force met weekly, and through these weekly meetings, bit by bit, we built trust, we built warmth, we built communication, and we offered childcare, we offered food at these parents task force meetings so that the moms would have less to worry about. And I'm happy to say that over the course of about 8 or 9 weeks in working with these moms, this parents task force, there was such energy that was built that their work continued long after our students finished their semester. And in fact, I heard through the grapevine that 1 or 2 more walking school buses took place on the parents' own initiative. So that was very exciting.
Very nice. Well, we actually are coming to the end of our time here. My alarm just went off. So with that, I wanted to thank Michelle and the whole Safe Routes team for the work that they do. Also Drs. Pandy and Vulgaris, Rick, and of course, Branka, Sue Ellen, and Justin for joining us today. And I wanted to also remind folks that for further reading, you can download the full report from the MTI website. And to our attendees, thank you for tuning in. And we hope to see you at the next Research Snap webinar, transit-oriented development versus park and rides, which is appropriate where? And that is on March 4th. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.